Okay, today we've got a video on U.S. immigration and the progressive movement. I've got a lot to talk about, try to do it in an efficient way. So let's begin. We're going to talk about 1820 to 1914, big time period, a lot of history to talk about. So we'll start with pull factors, reasons why Americans or immigrants would want to come to America. And it sort of begins with two essential ideas. You got your pull factors, good reasons why you'd want to come to America, and then you've got your push factors, sort of more negative reasons. So for pull factors, we begin with plenty of jobs in cities across America. Now, I'm specifically going to target Detroit, Chicago, and of course the big one is New York City, where we'll spend a lot of our time. Social mobility, the idea that you can move up, the true rags to riches story, like a guy like Andrew Carnegie, who really is able to come over, Scottish immigrant, comes over here and becomes a steel industry tycoon in many respects. There's free and abundant land, and I have a picture over there of the Homestead Act. That's 160 acres. You had to stay on the land for 5 years. But the idea is that immigrants can come over here, they can settle, and they can create a new life for themselves. And of course, religious freedom. The fact that the Anti-Federalists fought for the Bill of Rights, and in that Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the right to freedom of religion, is something that we fought for in this country and that we have. And so those are all reasons. And push factors, sort of, become like the opposites in many ways. The fact that many places did not have enough jobs. Speaking of Italy as a specific example, where they were struggling. Italian unification, Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Cavour. As I recall, my good children should stop bullying. That whole metaphor there. They are coming over in mass numbers, the Italians, and their goal really is get a job. They would take the toughest jobs, in some cases worst jobs, right? And they make enough money to send it home to their family. And that's what made these Italian immigrants a little bit different from many others, in that they weren't looking to stay. They were looking to send money back and eventually go back to Italy. But they came because there was no jobs. In many countries, there is a limited social mobility. I'll tell a story later about Jacob Riis and how Jacob Riis came to this country not because he really wanted to take advantage of the Homestead Act, but because he recognized that there was little social mobility in the place of Denmark where he was from. He wanted to move up the ladder. There was plenty of overcrowding in Europe, but there's also this religious persecution, and this component's really important to understand. We talk about the Jewish people and their suffering. We must know about pogroms. In the Jewish settlement of the Pale in Russia, they were attacked, killed, and those attacks, those waves, particularly after the Russo-Japanese War, where Russia was crushed by Japan, we'll see these flare up. But the Jewish people become scapegoats. And so they're leaving Russia in mass numbers, particularly in the early 1900s, to come to America because they're being attacked in their own country. And so we'll see waves of Jewish immigrants come to this country. And we've seen that throughout history, right, with the Jewish diaspora that we talk about in Global 9 so much. The Russo-Japanese War causes pogroms in 1905, and there are many more examples, but that's just more of the modern example. And you look to Tsar Nicholas II, you look to people like the Cossacks for examples. Global 2 things that we talk about, but they are relevant to American history as well. Now, to understand the ways of immigration, you can also split them into 2 groups. You've got the old immigrants, which we don't discuss as much. We will, but not as much as the new immigrants. And that's really our focus for this course. The old immigrants from 1820 to 1880, these are your Irish immigrants who are coming over because of the potato famine in record numbers. But these are also your French, your German, your Belgian, your Scandinavian immigrants. And so we would consider them Northern and Western Europe primarily is where these immigrants would come from. And the potato famine pushes Irish immigrants into this area. We call it the deluge, right? The massive amount of Irish immigrants coming into America in search of a better life, in search of jobs. On the other hand, you've got new immigrants. So after 1880, the old immigrants, the pouring in of Irish immigrants sort of trickles off, and you get a new wave. And that new wave is from southern and eastern Europe. Particularly Italy would be a great example. But a lot of the Slavic countries too. That area that we would call the Balkans. We would consider Russia to be a prime example. That's where the people, the Jewish people from the Pale, come over. And they will hit New York, and they will try to make a living for themselves. Greece, the Hungarians, the Austrians, all groups of people that will pour into America looking for a better life. So you got two waves. You got the old, and you've got the new, and you got to know the differences between the two groups. Now, as they pour in, the thing about new immigrants, that's our focus, right? So the new immigrants, very, very different culturally. You know, at least with the Germans, with the French, you know, there was this common heritage, common lineage. They weren't as different as maybe the new immigrants were. People didn't even hear about some of the countries that they were coming from, and they come over here, and so there's a big difference there. And what a lot of Americans started to be believing, and this is a real false narrative, but they believed that the new immigrants wouldn't be able to assimilate into American culture. This nativist, this ugly sentiment in America, it starts with the Irish, but it definitely applies to the new immigrants as well. And I'll give you, more specific examples of nativism in just a moment. Both groups are going to be processed at Ellis Island. That's the primary launching point for the immigrants. But that's not the only place. So I got a couple pictures of Ellis Island, some old photographs and things. People coming across. And when they're processed at Ellis Island, this is a very invasive process. Your basic humanity in some sense is being challenged. And often this processing, this lineup that you're in, they're checking you. Individuals are looking for and searching for, are you healthy, right? Are you a person that we want to have come into this country? And so now you got the Great Hall, where immigrants are going to be asked various questions, everything from what is your name to do you have a criminal record, all these things. And a lot of times what would happen is, you give them like a really long name, like, Igor Stanislavskevich, and it would just become like Igor Stanley. They would just shorten it, because if you see from the pictures, there's just so many people coming into Ellis Island at once, and not to excuse, totally culturally discriminatory behavior, but the idea is that they are pouring into this country and it's trying to be as quick and as effective as possible, while also, checking for disease, checking for imperfections. And so they had this whole system of, and you would get chalk marks, and if you got those chalk marks, it's a good chance you're going into the infirmary, and if you go there, there's a good chance you might be sent home. And so this was a scary time for immigrants, and I want that to be clear. This was not necessarily always a happy time. You had to make it through. Once you make it through Ellis Island, yes, then you're elated, then you're happy, but this whole time is like, you're going up a roller coaster, and you're just afraid of the drop, Okay. There's the infirmary at Ellis Island, and patients there. And I really like this, I don't know what to call it, a political cartoon. Got painting elements there, but the concept here is that you've got the old immigrants in the back. You've got like an old expedient Irish gentleman in the middle, right? And these old immigrants are saying, no, we don't want these new immigrants. And what we'll see happen in America is that the old immigrants, they go after the new immigrants. They do not want them in this country anymore. But the artist or the political cartoonist here is really commenting on the fact that these old immigrants were once in their shoes, were once in the new immigrants' shoes. And sort of the irony of that, I think, is being captured here. Now, I would be remiss not to talk about the other side of things. So while Ellis Island's taking in these European immigrants, Asian immigrants are coming through Angel Island in California. And a lot of these Chinese immigrants, but also Japanese immigrants too, are the ones that are going to come in and build the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, they're building it from sea to shining sea. This is an example of the economic nationalism that Manifest Destiny creates, where you are giving subsidies to railway companies, and they are trying to, in their best way, create a railroad that stretches across the country for shipping purposes so that America can be a strong economic powerhouse. And to do it, they have these Chinese immigrants. The Irish did it too, but the Chinese immigrants worked with this thing called nitroglycerin. It is a chemical that is dangerous. It is highly volatile. It explodes rather easily. And so you had to like hold it very steadily and make sure that it doesn't drop, because you drop that, your life's gone with it. Okay. So, not easy stuff. And when immigrants sort of arrive into New York City, one of the first things that they're going to look for, before they even look for a job, is they need to know where they're going to stay. And so what starts to develop is New York City, to account for all the immigrants, stops going horizontal and it starts going vertical. It starts going up. And they start building these really shoddy apartment buildings called tenements. Okay, this is urbanization, right? The massive movement of people into the cities. And to account for it, there are tenements that have no toilet, right? Imagine what that looks like, what that must feel like to, you have to go in the backyard, right? Terrible conditions that start up. You got 5 or more people in one room. You've got poorly lit homes. You've got no ventilation in these homes. Often you're not getting a window, right? And the real problem is you got to think, like, elderly people are coming and staying with family members in these tenements. If there's no light, right, as you're going down those steps, and maybe you're on the 5th floor and you're going down those steps and you slip and you fall, if you're elderly, you're breaking bones, right? So this is not a good setup for immigrants, and to live in a tenement like this, not an easy lifestyle. They call them dumbbell tenements. It's the style. You can sort of look at it. It looks like a dumbbell, right? Your hands would go in the center, right? And then on the outside, you got rooms on either side. Fast, able to get it up quickly, but it's also cheaply made. And one of the things about New York City tenements is that the wooden construction, if there's a fire, it's going to spread rather quickly. Okay. Here's the packed center of Mulberry Street in New York City. I really love this photo. It sort of captures the liveliness of New York City and just how many cultures and people are there. And a small detail, but one that I'd like you to pick up on. Everyone in New York City's got a hat. That's how you know it's New York City. Just a different culture, I think. I do a short reading about the 5 Points, which is the most dangerous area in New York City, a book by Tyler Anbinder, and it really just talks about the awful filth and real nastiness that you see in the 5 Points in this area called the Collect, and the back of the tenements were covered in just this greenish filth, and that has to do with people just throwing their waste out the windows. Okay, they put up boards so that you could walk back there in the backyard. This isn't a place where you're going to send your kids to go out and play. I have photos later on of people, children playing on the streets, and there's like a dead horse there. I mean, just absolutely gross stuff. So that's the big talk about immigration. I want to talk a little bit about politics and how that functions within this system. So I start with an essential question. Why did immigrants vote for politicians that literally bragged about being corrupt? I mean, we've got guys like William Boss Tweed who are saying, that they are corrupt. Like, so what about it? George Washington Plunkett talks about honest graft versus dishonest graft. The idea that you can take money as a politician and it be honest, right? That it be moral. He's taking that into question. So we must ask ourselves as historians, why did immigrants allow this? Why did Americans allow this system? And I think that you'll have some answers going forward. Not everyone in America liked immigrants. It's the same today as it was back then. You have nativists, and this is a real ironic term. You have native-born Americans who call themselves natives. I'm not speaking of Native Americans. That has nothing to do with this. I'm talking about people who were, quote-unquote, born in America and therefore consider themselves to be natives. And this hatred that forms against immigrants, we call it nativism. They're angry because their jobs are being taken away from them. And whether that's a rational thought or irrational thought, it happened, right? The Irish are the first to experience this. I mean, you've got in newspaper clippings, no Irish need apply. They don't want the Irish. They want to give it to certain ethnicities. You want a Protestant German. One of the things about the Irish was that they were Catholic. And so they believed that this Irish menace, was more loyal to a pope than they would be to the President of the United States. And so that anti-sentiment, this land of the free and the religious freedom that we get here, it wasn't perfect. No one would say that it is. And so the Irish come over, and the Irish are considered outsiders because of their loyalty to the Pope, and how irrational that is, right? But certainly was a real fear that Americans had. They demonstrated it, and so it was a real fear they had. Some of this stuff you never appear on a readings exam, but I feel like you need to know about it, and so I included it. We've talked about social Darwinism, survival of the fittest applied to the human race, right? Well, phrenology is an extension of that. It's a science. And basically what they would do, a phrenologist would measure skulls, and they believed that measuring skulls could predict intelligence. So they'd measure a bunch of skulls, and they would say that one class of people, the Irish, are dumber than the Swedish people, and they would move through these classes. And you had this evil science develop. It was all based on race. The idea that you could take a race and you could determine their intelligence, right, based on some science. It is totally ludicrous. It is totally awful. But the findings and what people believe spawned this awful movement called eugenics, okay, where African Americans, Native Americans, those with physical defects are sterilized. They are made so that they cannot have children, so that they cannot carry on what is seen as traits that are unfavorable to the human race. Now, if this sounds at all familiar to World War II Nazi Germany, you're right. Okay, the eugenics movement in America is alive and well, and Adolf Hitler sort of takes that train and builds upon it and makes it an awful, awful reality. Okay, but the eugenics movement in America, something that I'm embarrassed about as an American to say that we even had such a movement, but it was real. It did exist. We see it in policy extensions, nativism being part of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, where we're placing quotas on specific immigrants and telling which immigrants can come in and which cannot. That the Chinese and Japanese are totally removed. We have this gentleman's agreement with Japan that they only send a certain amount of immigrants. And so this nativist monster in America has sort of really reared its ugly head in policy as well as science. Okay. And to further that, in popular culture, we even see it. P.T. Barnum and Bailey's Circus. I know you heard of it before. P.T. Barnum may not have been an overt racist. He may not have, used, racist language overtly. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about P.T. Barnum to say that he did say that, right? But I do know what he did in his actions. P.T. Barnum would get a circus together. And what he would do is he'd dress up African Americans, or white people, to dress up as African Americans. So you got a white man dressing up as an African American. He'd do blackface, and he would act like an ape. He'd act like a total animal. He'd have fur on him. I mean, the whole nine. And the goal was to make and show that African Americans were less than. That was what he was trying to do, without saying it outright. And immigrants, would come in, and that's what they would see, and they would say, you know what? At the end of the day, at least I am not in that cage, right? And scholarship, historians, talk about, this real divide that is created between the immigrant population and African Americans. And you would think that they would be allies, at least from a Marxist perspective, right? They're both poor, and so therefore you would think they would come together. But that's clearly not the case. They are being divided. They are being wedged apart, African American and immigrant, and particularly the Irish, but they're not the only class of people that are. So these circuses, in my opinion, they push apart the races. They push apart the people of America, and they increase racial stereotypes. Not to mention taking advantage of people that are different from every average day American. And my evidence for this divide comes in the New York City draft riots of 1863, a horrible event in New York City history. Essentially, the Irish in particular, but other immigrants too. It wasn't just the Irish. I don't want to just attack them, even though I'm an Irishman myself. The immigrant population rises up. Abraham Lincoln decides to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And you know from a good study of the Emancipation Proclamation that all African Americans are freed in states of rebellion. Not in the border states, right? Not in the border states, but the Emancipation Proclamation frees African Americans who are in the Confederacy. And so there becomes this narrative that he's fighting a war, him being Abraham Lincoln, to free the slaves. Immigrants say that they're not slaves, they have no interest in this war, and therefore they do not want to fight it. And so they rise up, and when there is a draft in which you had to pay $300 to get out of the draft, otherwise you were drafted in, when that happens, the immigrant population rises up. And instead of going after the people who are calling the shots and calling the decisions, they go after African Americans. They burn an orphanage. I mean, to just talk about how the racist atmosphere that exists in New York City, and just how awful that hate is to burn an orphanage of all places. Disgraceful. And ultimately, Abraham Lincoln, he has his federal troops, he has to bring them from Gettysburg to New York City to put down this riot. It is that bad that you need federal troops to stop this riot. So, a blemish on New York City history for sure. It was apocalyptic. I encourage you to read about it. Just horrible. Now, in politics, the native-born Americans form a party called the Know-Nothing Party. You should know it, okay? The Know-Nothing Party formed, and the real primary goal was to protect Native Americans who were trying to work and to kick immigrants out of the country in any way that they could, through policy, like the Johnson-Reed Act, for example. And they were called the Know-Nothings because if you were, going to go up to a Know-Nothing party member and ask them about their policies and ask them about their membership, you were supposed to say, "I know nothing," right? I know nothing. It's supposed to be like, kind of Fight Club-ish in a way. And particular policy that they were able to get passed or push to pass is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Again, setting up quotas to limit immigrants coming from China. So nativism not confined just to the Irish, to all immigrants. Now, on the other hand, so you got the Know-Nothings, right? Then you have the Republicans who practice this policy, we call it assimilation. Basically, they look down upon immigrant culture and they say you need to become more like America. Speak English, dress differently, right? The idea is to come in and adopt our culture. And, maybe not as aggressive as a Carlisle school, which Native Americans were forced into, but the same principles apply. That is that your culture is inferior to ours, and therefore you need to adopt our cultural values and our traditions and our language, and leave all that other stuff behind. So out of these two groups, right, the Know-Nothings and the Republicans, immigrants are looking like, probably wouldn't join a Know-Nothing party, and you probably wouldn't join a Republican party either. So there's one more. And that is the Democrats. And the Democrats see an opportunity. They see an opportunity to help immigrants, but they want something in return. They want votes, because voting equals power. So if I have all of the immigrant vote, then I am going to own political elections. I'm going to own the political office. And here's the interesting thing about New York City. They created what was called machine politics. They had an organization called Tammany Hall. If you belong to Tammany Hall, great for you because you had a job and you probably were very, very wealthy. In exchange for the votes, they would offer jobs to immigrants. A lot of the Irish are given jobs as police officers, right? And those jobs, they take them, and the Irish were, in many cases, not concerned with upholding the peace. What police officers, and why we see so much crime in New York City, is that these same police officers would go around and they would offer protection, but they would also require bribes. So gambling dens would be allowed to exist as long as they paid off these police officers. And so the Tammany Hall Democrats, they're giving jobs. There is no civil service exam to pass, and therefore they can get as many jobs as they can. And this creates this corrupt scheme. We call it patronage, okay? Where I am going to ask that you vote for me, but on the other hand, I am going to give you a job at the end of the day. Immigrants would vote for these corrupt politicians because on Thanksgiving, they're out there handing out turkeys, right? When a fire breaks out across the tenements, it is the Democrats that are there saying, what do you need? How can I help you? And so they are more likely to, as immigrants, more likely to allow some of this corruption to sort of go on because they know the Democrats have their back when there is a crisis. You may not agree with it, but that's the system that sort of worked. And I tell my students all the time, voting day in New York City is different from what voting day is today. It's a boxing match. Guys are out there fighting for the ballot, because if you own the ballot station, you own New York City politics. You own the jobs, therefore you own the money. So it's very important that you get as many people out to vote as possible. Bosses, political leaders known as bosses, would come down. They'd have their gangs beat up anyone who tried to vote for the opposite party, in this case Republican. Immigrants would vote many times. They wouldn't just vote once. So they would come in with a beard, then maybe they would come in with a goatee, then a mustache, then go clean shaven, and you could get 4 or 5 votes out of one immigrant. They would come in, they'd vote a couple of times, and you would hold the ballot. You would just hold on to that polling station. Other times what you do is you'd send your gang out, and your gang would go to a Republican ballot box, and you would beat up all the Republicans there, take the ballot box, and throw it right into New York City Harbor. Okay, this is a violent day in New York City. A lot of fighting going on during this time. There's corruption all around. We talked about Irish police officers who are taking cuts of the vice districts and making it profitable. We got examples of guys like Big Tim Sullivan, who are gangsters but become senators. I mean, a guy was a straight thug that is able to rise to the U.S. Senate. No other time in history do we see this type of corruption in politics, so overt, so expressive, so open, right? You didn't try to hide it, and it was very clear that these guys were taking cuts from the city, and it didn't matter, okay? You can argue that we're corrupt today. You can say the same things if you'd like, but the difference is these guys were much more willing to show it, much more willing to not try to hide it as much. Different gangs form up as a result of protection against these native groups. So you've got each ethnicity having its own different variety or its own different group or gang to protect its people. You got the Irish who had the Dead Rabbits gang, made famous by Gangs of New York, the great movie. You got the Jewish people who have the Eastman gang, led by Monk Eastman. You've got the Nativists who have their own set of groups. The Bowery Boys would be one, but there are others, of course. The Italians had the 5 Points gang, because get this, they lived in the 5 Points. There's great and crazy stories of the Dead Rabbits, women who file their teeth down before battle to be able to bite hard into these guys. I mean, just brutal stuff. This is a time of robbery and pickpocketing and brawling, and there's all sorts of type of things going on. It is an interesting time in New York City history. And of course, Gangs of New York would be a great film to check out with your parents' permission, of course. Now, let's talk about the political system that exists and be more explicit about it. So how do they make money off of politics? And there's really 2 ways, patronage and graft. Patronage we've talked about. Patronage is the concept that I expect you to vote for me, but I'm going to give you something in return. Okay, I'm going to give you a job. I'm going to give you a Thanksgiving Day turkey, right? I am going to take care of you when your house is on fire. I'm going to look out for you on the streets. My thugs will make sure that you can get to work when you need to. So that's patronage. And as patronage works, graft is sort of the thing that's the extension. Ward bosses, like William Boss Tweed, are going to take money from taxpayers. They're going to do it. And William Boss Tweed was famous for his use of kickbacks. And that was how he took so much money. Basically what happened was The courthouse should have cost $250,000. That's what it should have cost. It didn't. It ended up costing $13 million because of this kickback idea. So what kickbacks basically are is I will hire a couple contractors, a carpenter, a painter, someone to do the carpets. And all of these people will give me a price. So let's say the carpenter gives me a price. He says, it's going to cost $10,000 to do some of the woodwork in this courthouse. He's going to be there for a couple months, right? What Boss Tweed would say is, no, it's not going to cost you $10,000. It's going to cost you $40,000, right? And what he would do is he would give that guy, maybe he would give him 15 grand, and then he'd pocket the rest of it for himself. And he would overcharge, and with that overcharge, he'd sort of like split a little bit of the profit with the contractor, and then take the rest for himself. And this awful scheme, called kickbacks, worked really well for Boss Tweed in the short term, not good in the long term. To give you an example, it cost $180,000 for 3 tables and 40 chairs. Those must have been some really nice tables and chairs, right? Okay. Now, William Boss Tweed was not caught by some long pamphlet, some huge extension of writing. Instead, he was caught by pictures, by political cartoons. A guy by the name of Thomas Nast started drawing cartoons like this, where William Boss Tweed is implicated in schemes, where he is looked at like a king, right? That's what he's supposed to sort of be represented over there. Somebody who's getting fat off of the people. And this is something that immigrants could gravitate to. They could look at this and they could understand it. They didn't need to read, because one of the things about new immigrants coming into this country is some of them did not, and many of them did not, know how to read or read well. Okay, there's one thing to be able to recognize a few words. It's a totally different thing to be able to read these long pamphlets or to have time to do that. And so these political cartoons scared Boss Tweed the most. And these political cartoons, they shed light on corruption. Tweed himself was actually imprisoned. He was stuck in prison. But a man that, bought all the cops, right, and gave them all jobs, he doesn't last long. So he gets out of jail, goes to Spain. But the story goes that the Spanish officials recognized him through a Thomas Nast cartoon, and so he was sent back, and that is where he dies 3 years later in prison. And so William Boss Tweed rots away, doesn't get to spend much of that money that he had accumulated as being a ward boss of New York City. But he is remembered for his kickbacks in the New York City courthouse. A really great quote that you can read there. This sort of speaks to his fear of political cartoons. A picture worth 1,000 words, right? Thomas Nast, famous for our conceptualization of what Santa Claus looks like. It's pretty cool. All right, we'll keep moving, and we'll get into the progressive movement. So this would probably be a good spot for you to pause, but I'm just going to kind of keep going and power through the progressive movement and try to do my best here. So I talk about the progressive movement. What does that mean for us? And quite simply, the progressive movement means positive change. Okay. Now, will it be positive for everybody? Absolutely not. Perspective is key in history. Across all historical lines, perspective is key. But in this case, the progressive movement really means we're going to have some positive change in America. And let's talk about that a little bit. I have this huge graphic organizer to sort of, I guess, act as a summary for you. And the summary is that the progressive movement is all of these things. It is consumer protection. It is compulsory education. It is the secret ballot. It's the 16th. It's the 17th. It's the 19th. It's the 18th Amendment with prohibition. It is all of these things sort of tied together. But the real goal of the progressive movement, what the reasons why I ask you, is that the goal is to create economic and social change in America and clean up the streets, for lack of a better phrase. And to do that, they will do it in politics first. I'm not here to tell you that you have to memorize the differences between an initiative and a referendum and a recall. Maybe if you're in an AP course you would, but for us, the important part is that these things all allow us to have more control over the people that we vote in. That is, through a recall, we can vote an elected official out of office before the term ends, right? That we have that power, that we can do petitions, or that, we can have some control over the people that we actually hire into office. That is important to the American system of voting, and I think that that was a good thing that we were trying to do. So that's something that you need to know. You need to know that initiatives, referendums, and recalls give more power to American voters. That is key. Please know that. Second, civil service exams are really, really important because patronage no longer the system that's used so overtly, outright. Instead, what they decide to do is they give you an exam that you must pass. So, for example, as a teacher, I had to pass certain exams to get my license. In fact, I had to do 4 of them, and it costs around $1,000. I mean, it's expensive, right? But the goal is that you take those exams, and those help prove that you deserve a license to be a teacher. Among other things. There's so much more that I had to do, but that's sort of like the broad scheme. The 17th Amendment is another good amendment, I think. Senators are now voted on by the people. People have control over that. It used to be that it was a state legislature, and it was kind of this like good old boys club where if you knew people, you could get into the Senate. They try to fight that, and they try to say, listen, the American people, they should be in power, and they should be voting in these senators. It should not just be a foregone conclusion. And so the 17th Amendment attacks that. Direct election of senators, 17th Amendment. In this country, we had a wave of populism. And populism, to simplify it, is really when a lot of people, when the mass amount of people come together and they all want something. We consider that wave populism. And there are a lot of things that populism was not able to achieve. But those ideas that the Populist Party come up with, we see them in our country. For example, the Populist Party argues that we should have more government intervention in the economy. That laissez-faire is not a perfect system, and that we need to control these big trusts, these big corporations, and do something meaningful about their power. So we'll see the national income tax. That was a populist demand and something that we do, right? We have an income tax in this country. The direct election of senators, right? That is a populist idea that finally becomes an amendment. Antitrust laws against big business. I'm thinking of the Sherman Antitrust Act that, for all of its failures, it was a start. And the Clayton Antitrust Act really sort of cements that. And I'll talk more about that. Now, a populist leader to know, somebody that you should be aware of, is William Jennings Bryan. And I think that one of the key reasons why he doesn't become more popular, let's say, is because he wants to take America from the gold standard to silver. And a lot of Americans were not behind this. Many Americans thought that was foolish to do. And so the populist demand sort of, kind of splinters off with this. And people aren't willing to go rally around William Jennings Bryan. I'm not saying that's the only issue, but that was one of the key ones for the Populist Party. The Populist Party also has roots in what we call the Grange Movement. And when you see the Grange Movement, you got to think farmers. Basically, the Grange is a group of farmers who are really, really angry because railway monopolies. Think Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, or Jay Gould, guys who totally own the market, or totally own railways companies. What they do is they start increasing their prices to abnormal levels. And the Grange Movement's goal was, we need the government to step in and attack these monopolies because that's not fair to us. We are working very hard, and yet we're not seeing the fruits of our labor. And so these hiked shipping costs need to change, and that's what the Grange Movement is sort of fighting for. And the populist movement takes the Grange Movement, and they sort of coalesce together, and they work together to fight for farmers. Okay, the Grange Movement is fighting for farmers' rights. Economic rights, really. The Grange Movement will unify, and they will ask for the Sherman Antitrust Act. They believe that the Sherman Antitrust Act will give the government the power it needs to disrupt the monopolies. And this act does help. But we also talked about in class how the Sherman Antitrust Act's language was used to attack unions as well. And so the language needed to be cleaned up a bit, and it will. later on with the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. And it makes sure that unions are not attacked as much as the Sherman Antitrust Act. Still not perfect by any means, but the Clayton Antitrust Act, it goes after trusts. That's exactly what it does. But it's worded better to make sure that that unions do not suffer under the weight of this act as well. This is one thing you got to know. You got to star it, you got to highlight it, you got to listen to me 1,000 times on it. Whatever you got to do, you got to know that the Federal Reserve System, it's on your dollar bills, it's on your money that you use. Pull out a dollar bill, you'll see it there, okay? In 1913, it gives the federal government the power to have control over the money supply. That is, they can raise and they can lower interest rates during a recession, make it easier for people to borrow money or make it harder for them to borrow money. Okay, that is critical. The Regents really, really wants you to know what the Federal Reserve does. It deals with money. It deals with the control of money supply. Again, rewind it if you got to, but know the Federal Reserve, please. A couple of guys to know. The Wagner Act of 35 legalizes collective bargaining. You should know what that is by now. We've talked about it a bit. You've acted it out in two different ways. So collective bargaining, important. Samuel Gompers is a guy who advocates for collective bargaining, but also striking. He leads the American Federation of Labor. Good guy to know. And the labor union leader, Eugene Debs, is a guy that I think is interesting. First candidate, socialist candidate for presidency. He runs his campaign from jail, okay? So, obviously, he doesn't win, but he is the first step, first socialist candidate to make it on a ballot. And it really challenges this idea that America is only capitalist, right? That maybe there are some socialist elements that need to be adopted. And we'll see that in the Great Depression, that we do take some of those ideas. Maybe we won't admit it, but we do take some ideas. More social reform, Al Smith and Francis Perkins. Maybe never on a Regents exam, but I think they're really important because after the Triangle Fire, these two people step up. They do not stop until they make changes, and they form the Factory Investigative Commission, or FIC. Basically, Al Smith would not get off the floor until he got people to listen to him, until he got people to agree that there needs to be a standard to be upheld when you have big factories with a lot of people working in them. And these people are the reason why you see, occupancy signs, max occupancy signs, where you see that you have to have 2 ways to leave a room at all times, right? These people make real change in your life, whether you realize it or not. David Von Drell writes a really great book on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. Riveting and very, very in-depth, but he talks about these two guys at length. Jane Addams, another reformer that creates the Hull House in Chicago, and her goal is give the poor people a place to go when they don't have any other place to be. And eventually these places, they'll have a Christian education to give to these people as well. But we're really thinking about social justice. When we think of the progressive movement, Jane Addams, one of those people who's really thinking about how can I help the people that need the most help. And so the Hull House is a way to do that. And of course, Chicago would be where that is. Jacob Riis, another reformer, uses flash photography and really able to open the eyes of the rich to the suffering of the poor. That is what his goal was and what he's able to do through his book, How the Other Half Lives. And more pictures than anything. But those pictures, they make people really have difficulty looking away at the suffering of others. He does it through flash photography. He comes from Denmark, a beautiful place. I tell a story of a rough childhood where Jacob Riis watches his brother drown, and ultimately his mother's really just sort of PTSD hits her really hard after this event. She's never really the same, and Jacob Riis would see his mother staring off into the chair where his brothers used to sit. And one day he decided to go out and give a present. He wasn't very rich himself, but he decided to give a present to a poor family on Christmas Day. He gave away his gifts. I mean, he's just a stand-up guy. Eventually, he'd he'd meet his wife Elizabeth Nielsen, and Elizabeth would give him a locket with her hair and tell him that he needs to go to America and make a better living and come back and take her with him when he does. And so Jacob went across to the 5 Points. It was said that he had $40 with him when he went to the 5 Points. He took $20 to buy a gun because it was that type of place. You know, crime everywhere, just a dangerous place to be. He couldn't find a job. He felt the nativism. He felt the hatred towards him. And one day he got really, really lucky. He was on a street, crossed to a alleyway, and he saw a dog. And that dog just like spoke to him in some way, because that dog wagged his tail. And that was like the first act of kindness he'd ever seen in New York City. And so with that, Jacob Riis goes on to take that dog everywhere with him. And one night he was a little bit colder than normal, and so he decided to go to a police lodging house, look something like that. And there's a police officer outside, and so he, goes to walk in, and the police officer says, "Well, you can come in, but the dog can't." And so Jacob makes a decision. He leaves his best friend outside, and he goes inside. Well, he goes to bed, and when he wakes up, he's reaching for his locket, the one that Elizabeth gave to him, and it's nowhere to be found. And so he starts to lose it, right? And he's making this huge ruckus, and the police officer comes in and tries to throw him out. And Jacob just loses his mind, fights back with the police officer, and the police officer ends up on top of him outside on the front steps. And the dog does what dogs do, tries to save its owner. And so he runs at the police officer, grabs his arm, and the police officer hits the dog, beats the dog over the head with a police baton, and kills the dog right on the steps. Now Jacob's looking at him with a gun in his pocket that he bought for $20, and he wanted to pull that trigger. And if you read, notes about him, he wanted to kill that police officer, and he didn't. Instead, he decided he was going to move out of New York City, go to a place called Philadelphia, try to make it big there, and luckily he became an investigative reporter, learned the ins and outs of reporting. He decided that he was going to come back to New York City, take his skills of investigative reporting, and shine a light on New York City. And so he did, with his flash photography. And he would go at night, and he'd take photos like this, of the Gleaner. He would take photos of these little boys, right, huddled in the street. And he would do it at night. He'd take all these different photos. Children who are losing their hair, children who have no business being outside at midnight, right? And children who are playing with dead horses in the street. And he did this, and he showed it to people. And he said, "Listen, this is where they are living like. We need to fix this." And he had a buddy by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, police commissioner in New York City, to help him along, to make sure he was safe. And when he published this book and got it out, tenements started to have to abide by certain codes. Sort of like the way the Factory Investigation Committee worked. They had coding that tenements had to uphold to. And Jacob Riis does that. His photos do that. And his courage does that. And it was his way of repaying the debt to his best friend who lost his life on those fateful steps in New York City. Eventually, Elizabeth would come with Jacob, but she would not live a very long life. I think she only lived a couple of years after she came to America. Okay. Now, we talk about muckraker Upton Sinclair next. And I won't give you, the huge, long, story that I do with my students, other than to say this. He went undercover in the meatpacking industry. Just like Jacob Riis went undercover and, went through tenement by tenement, he went undercover in the meat industry. And his goal was, I need to talk about and I need to see what the meat industry is like, because I'm hearing bad things. I know it's bad, but I need proof. And he starts to realize that they're taking sausage, expired sausage, from Europe and bringing it back to America. They are shoe-shining it up with glycerin. They are bleaching all of the bacteria off with borax, and they're calling it sausage. And he's saying this is awful. People are falling into these giant vats. They are getting eaten crushed and spun alive and cut up, and it just, all of these awful things are happening to the workers, and essentially he's arguing like we're eating people, you know, by doing this. There's like cannibalism going on in some way, and he's writing this in this book called The Jungle. And basically his argument is that the meatpacking industry is like a jungle. It has no rules, has no oversight, and that is a problem. And when people read this book about what they're eating, well, first it grosses them out, of course, right? But second, it's like, we need to fix that. Like, whatever that's going on, if that is happening, it needs to end. Here's a picture of the meatpacking industry. Great story, Yergis and Ona. I encourage you to read it by Upton Sinclair. It's an excellent read. You know, just don't eat a lot of food and then read it. I wouldn't do that. And it has clear results. So Upton Sinclair in the meatpacking industry, the Food and Drug Administration was created. Their goal: inspect food, inspect medicine, make sure that consumers are protected, right? This is the progressive movement. This is about societal problems being fixed. It's passed the Elastic Clause, which I teach as a legislative branch's superpower. The idea that even though something's not written in the Constitution, you have the ability, at least, to expand the power as long as you're protecting the Constitution, and that's what the FDA is supposed to do. It's supposed to protect the people, and by extension, protect the Constitution in that way. The Meat Inspection Act does exactly what you think it does. There's regulations for the meat industry that they must uphold. And you've got limits. You know, you can't have certain amounts of chemicals in your meat. You know, like you shouldn't be using borax in your sausage. That shouldn't be allowed. And so the Meat Inspection Act does that. And I know it all sounds like common sense, but clearly it needed to be said, because these problems that Upton Sinclair brings about in The Jungle, these were real problems. They needed to be fixed. Now, reformer Lewis Hine. He is interesting to me. While the Regents exam does not talk about Lewis Hine a whole lot, it does not go and give him the time that he needs. Lewis Hine is an interesting character in that he fought against child labor. Grew up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Say that 5 times fast. And in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, he was grew up as a dairy farmer. You know, that's what he was supposed to be. But of course, he didn't want to be a dairy farmer. And so he decided to get a teaching license and move to New York City. And he got a job very quickly. He had his wife with him, and part of the job was, as a teacher, is that you needed to have a camera and be a part of the yearbook club. You know, just be like the advisor to that. And so he'd take the camera and, you know, do what he had to do during school hours and everything. But over the weekend, his wife would go out with him, and they would go out to Ellis Island. They take photos, take pictures, you know. And these pictures, really well done. Just the way that they're sort of captured is really interesting to me. But he takes all these photos, and he starts to think about, you know, at the beginning of the year in September, you know, he has like 20 students, right? But by the end of the year, he's got like 8 students. And it happens every year, right? And he's starting to wonder, like, what is going on with my students? Where are they all going? And so he goes door to door and really tries to find out where these kids are going. And quickly, after talking to a bunch of families, he figures out that all these kids are going to work. They're all going to work. And so he makes it his mission to fix that, because he says that's not right. A child should not have to go to work. If there's some sort of choice, maybe, but they shouldn't be having to go to work. Let's fix that. And he becomes a part of the NCLC. And the NCLC's job is to root out child labor. How do you do it? You gotta make people feel for it. You gotta make people see it. And so he goes and he starts taking photos, because that's what he's good at, right? And he starts taking photos like this. Right? What's this boy doing? You know, smoking a pipe, 12 years old. You got the newsies out there working instead of going to school. He says that's a problem. This little boy doesn't even have shoes on. Right? What is going on in this country that we call America? And so he starts taking photos. And one of the things that he was famous for is he would go into a factory And he would get the pose, sort of like, he'd come in and he would say, I need to take a photo because I'm going to put you in this magazine, and your factory is the greatest factory ever, and I'm going to make you famous. And so the guy would be like, oh, yeah, of course, take some photos of the factory machinery, And so he'd like set up, and he'd take forever to set up. So eventually the manager would be like, all right, I got to go, and manage, or whatever managers do. And so Lewis Hine would be all alone. And he would take that camera that he set up, and he'd go take pictures of the workers. And he'd find pictures, like this. Breaker boys who broke shale. Can you imagine what that does to you when you're breaking shale up and all that's going into your mouth, and dust, the black lung that's caused. But you take a picture of a boy like Furman Owens, 12 years old, can't read, working in the mill for 4 years. That's not right. Photos of children working in the mills, their hands so small that they were really useful for fixing machines. Addie Card, age 12. When asked how old she was, she replied, I don't remember, right? This shouldn't happen in America. You shouldn't have child labor that looks like that, where children are out, in a cannery, their feet getting cut up and torn up by the shells. And so Lewis Hine works to fix that. And he will. He will get child labor reform. He will get child labor laws enacted. And it's not because he was the best writer. It's because those photos changed the way people saw child labor. When you see it, it's a lot harder to, ignore it. And so we have laws in this country for that reason. So Lewis Hine, associated with child labor. Upton Sinclair in the meatpacking industry. You got Jacob Riis with tenements. And now we go on to African American history. African American history is interesting. I taught a civil rights elective on it, and I'm boiling down a lot. But there was this real movement in America. What do we do as African Americans? Do we pursue higher education, as a W.E.B. Du Bois would want us to? Or do we go for more of a trade school mentality? And that was what Booker T. Washington argues for. And these two men, pillars of the African American community, are going to make a change. They're going to make a real difference. But they see the issue of civil rights from two different lenses. So, Du Bois is going to argue that education is key. If you want to be politically equal, if you want to be socially equal, you have to get the highest education you can. You have to improve your intellect. You have to improve your speech, your vocabulary. You have to make it to the top. Get your doctorate's degree, right? Get your master's degree. Do that. Higher education is the path to equality. Well, Booker T. Washington says, first, we need to put money in our pocket. And that's going to happen with trade schools. If you do that, then we will be able to get equality. In other words, work for economic equality first, and then you can get the political and social equality that you're looking for. And so Washington creates trade schools. He was born poor, educated through a trade school, and so obviously that slants his opinion. He opens the Tuskegee Institute to train African Americans in trades and skills, and really has that focus on making money. You wanna ask for political rights, you gotta put money in your pocket. And he was criticized for that. He was criticized because people saw him as a gradualist. Why would you wait for equality? This shouldn't be something that you're fighting for. Equality, in other words, should be a natural right that you are given, that you shouldn't have to earn it by making some sort of economic advancement first, right? That the 13th Amendment argues for freedom, the 14th gives you citizenship, and the 15th gives you the right to vote, but none of them say that you have to have a certain amount of money in your pocket before you're going to be respected. Okay, and so he was criticized for that. On the other hand, Washington said, listen, this is reality. This is what we live with. You may not like it, but this is the true path to freedom. Du Bois, he's a Harvard graduate, right? PhD. And so he has this concept called the talented 10. Basically that African Americans will improve their situation because of the best of African American intellect. that the highly educated will pave the path for the people that are not as educated. And we need that leadership to right the wrongs that African Americans are clearly facing. And he's saying we need immediate change, right? We need it now, and we're not going to wait. And so he leads the NAACP, which we will talk about so much more. So it's a good thing to know. He's influential in the famous African-American newspaper, The Crisis. The guy is just everywhere. And he is a real pillar, a real leader in the African-American community for this reason. So, we've gotten through African-American leadership. You've got the basics, and that's all that was, just the basics. I'm finishing up, I'm running out of steam a little. Let's do President Teddy Roosevelt and his sort of upbringing, and if we can do that, I think we'll be in a good spot for the progressive movement. So, Teddy Roosevelt, just quick background, right? 26th President of the United States, and he's going to do a lot. A busy guy. There's a whole story that I tell. I'll just kind of sort of simplify it for the purposes of this lecture, that he's going to be vice president to William McKinley. McKinley is assassinated by that anarchist Leon Solgatz, who sneaks in and is able to shoot the president. He's got like a cast on, and he comes up to the president and eventually kills him. And so he's sort of thrust into the presidency, and he's going to do a lot because that's what Teddy Roosevelt does. He is everywhere. And as president, he's a strong president. I don't think that that's something that you can really argue. He's going to go after the monopolies. He broke a 44 trust, used the Sherman Antitrust Act, and later the Clayton Antitrust Act. The man is known as a trust buster. That is his nickname. You see that in textbooks, or you see that in any person who really talks about Teddy. You got to know the trust busting. He wants you to obey the law in this political cartoon, and he will use any method he needs to get that accomplished. In diplomacy, he's got this really interesting view. He's got the Roosevelt corollary, basically an extension of what James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine was. So if you recall, the Monroe Doctrine talks about Latin America being off limits to Europeans, like stay out. Well, he takes it a step further and says not only should Europeans stay out, but Americans should stay in. That we should have a quote-unquote sphere of influence, okay, over Latin America. They will be like, our little semi-colonies of sorts, and we will control that. We will build a canal called the Panama Canal through Latin America so that we can ship our goods more fast and more efficient, and we will really have our hands in Latin America. So it's not just Europe, you stay out. It's America is going to stay in, okay? And his famous motto, speak softly but carry a big stick. Have a really strong military. You don't need to tell people about it, though. You just need to have that military really powerful and really ready, and that will do the talking for itself. And America, of course, as Roosevelt's president, is going to engage in some imperialism. A story for another day, of course. Roosevelt is also known for his conservation, and that's because he had a lot of time in the Badlands, Dakota. And in the Badlands, TR is famous. He's going to work on national parks. He's going to work on clean water projects. He's going to try to preserve the Great Plains of America and big game and all those things. He wants to make sure that America does not become a place of deforestation. He wants to make sure that we preserve our wildlife. And so not only is he a trust buster, not only is he into conservation, not only is he extending influence into Latin America, he's doing all of these things at once and trying to become, as the political cartoon suggests, sort of like this policeman of the world. And we're going to see that the isolationism that President Washington gave in his farewell address, right? Stay out of European affairs. That was like this big message. Teddy Roosevelt isn't really heeding that message anymore. He's expanding more and more and more. And while Americans aren't totally 100%, over into European affairs, we're seeing a shift in American policy where we're going away from the Washington view of isolationism and more towards what everyone else is doing in that imperialism game. we'll start stepping into China. If you recall the spheres of influence, we're going to establish the open door policy. Things are going to become different in America now. And so I leave you with this. The progressive movement, a time where there's going to be a lot of change in American politics, society, and the real goal is we need to fix the economic and social problems that exist, and certain reformers, Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, you need to know these people. From African American perspective, you need to know about Du Bois and Booker T. Washington to understand how the civil rights movement progresses. These are important aspects. We're going to see a lot of change during this period. It's going to amplify. And we'll talk about imperialism. We'll talk about World War I. But this sort of sets the groundwork for what's going to happen later on. So thank you for listening. I hope this video helped. It's everything that I've taught on this unit. Please check out Regents exams to practice the Regents language. One of the frustrating things is that I give you all this content, but the language is muddled. Okay, so practice your exams. And good luck, guys.